the field has evolved, and in particular as it comes to identity and immigration, this idea that there is one experience, and that we can kind of understand the experience of immigrants from Latin America, from Asia, et cetera. We now understand that it's way more complex, right? There's multiple lived realities and experiences.
Because when thinking like in the globalization world, when we think about just two identities, it doesn't reflect what people live in. And sometimes even when thinking about, for example, the media, they can adopt identity from a place that they've never been to.
And so, when you ask what's the relationship, I was like, what is it before? Is it after? Is it moderating? Is it mediating? I think the relationship between identity and immigration is so mutually complex.
Hello, everyone, and good night or evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you happen to be on the globe. And thank you for joining us. My name is Elli Schachter. I'm from Ilan University in Israel, and I am currently president of ISRI, which is the International Society for Research on Identity. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our second year of the ISRI webinar series. And as people trickle in, before we get to our topic, just a really quick note. Our next ISRI conference will be held in Vilnius at the end of June, right before the SSEA mini conference in Potsdam. So keep your eyes open for our calls, and you might even get to fit in a double header. And if anyone wants to get our calls and you're not on our list, you can sign up for our mailing list. The link is at the bottom of the invitation that I sent out, and I will also paste it now to the chat. Okay, so if anyone wants to get on our list. And okay, so for our last face-to-face ISRI meeting, we were hosted by SSEA generously, the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood, and in Charlottesville, and we had a great time together, and we wanted to continue the partnership. So since we both host online webinars, we decided that from time to time, when one group has a topic that might interest the other, we'll collaborate and invite speakers and members from both communities to join in together. So this is the first of these collaborations, and ISRI organized today's event, but we've teamed up with colleagues from SSEA who helped us out, and I'm thrilled to meet you and see all of you today and join you when you organize yours, and this will be great. So our topic tonight is Crossing Borders, Shifting Selves, Conversations on Immigration and Identity. And we've gathered quite a few experts on this topic. And rather than present a series of formal research presentations, the six of us decided to structure this as a roundtable discussion. And not that we'll disregard empirical studies, but we wanted to focus on trends, on conceptual frameworks, on new developments in the field, and explore how these ideas might have changed over time. So hopefully we'll have a lively and stimulating conversation. And to moderate such a group, you need a mixture of expertise and the ability to ask naive questions from a layperson's perspective. So I will gladly and quite authentically be the inexperienced amateur. And I've invited my friend and colleague, Professor Sophie Walsh from my university, who is a true expert, to be my moderating partner. So thank you, Sophie. And we'll begin with a brief introduction of our panelists. And let's see how, okay. And then we'll continue with some guiding questions for the panel. And then in the last 15 minutes, we'll open up for Q&A. Okay, so I will add our panelists on to the spotlight if we all are. Okay. So we'll begin with Daysi. Daysi Ximena is an assistant professor at the Jane Addams College of Social Work in the University of Illinois, Chicago. And her immigrant background shaped her research interests in the educational and developmental trajectories of undocumented immigrants from Latin America. And her most recent study is a community-based participatory research project examining the life course implications of legal exclusion on the lives of undocumented Latinas in the suburbs of Chicago. So that really sounds like a hot issue and quite interesting. Professor Linda Juang is Professor of Inclusive Education at the University of Potsdam, Germany. And her research focuses on migration, identity, discrimination, and socialization among minoritized youth and families. And she's currently the editor of Child Development Perspectives. Thank you for joining us. And Maya Benish Weisman. Professor Benish Weisman is full professor and vice dean of the academic teaching Dean of Academic Teaching at the School of Social Work and Social Welfare from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's a recipient of multiple competitive research grants from the ERC, BSF, ISF, DFG, and Jacobs Foundation, and has authored numerous peer-reviewed articles and serves as counseling editor of the European Journal of Personality. And here, her research focuses on values and social behavior among adolescents, value trajectories, and youth adjustment, and the psychological effects of immigration, especially on ethnic identity. And then we have Seth. Professor Seth Schwartz is professor of kinesiology. Did I say that right?
Yeah,
Health
that's good enough.
education and educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. And he is past president of SSEA and editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Intercultural Relations, and also the author of The Savvy Academic, publishing in the social and health sciences, and the forthcoming book, Understanding Acculturation. Great. And last, my co-moderator, Professor Sophie Walsh, is full professor and head of the Department of Criminology at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and she's Deputy Secretary General of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology. She serves on the editorial boards of the International Journal for Intercultural Relations and the Journal of Youth and Adolescence, and her research centers on risk and resilience among adolescents and emerging adults, specializing in minority youth and the psychological mechanism underlying identity and risk behavior. So, great. So now we have everyone accounted for, and let's begin. So my first question is, identity and immigration, two different fields of study. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share, each of you, a brief perspective on how the two concepts relate to each other, why they should be related, why just as an introduction for everyone. So who wants to start?
I'll start if that's okay.
Sure.
So as you mentioned, well, first of all, this is great to be doing this collaboration between SSEA and ISRI. So thanks everybody for coming. And I hope we can do many more of these. As you mentioned in the introduction, my research focuses on undocumented immigrants. And so when we think about undocumented immigrants who don't have the right to live or work in the United States, that sense of identity, sense of belonging is very much affected by the state, right? So who we are, where we belong, do we belong somewhere is all a part of our identity. But in the case of undocumented immigrants, the state is really constraining that, right? They're basically saying, hey, you are not a member of this society. But that's occurring even as they really are a member of society because they're living here. So for those who arrive as children, they're growing up in the United States. They're attending schools with US-born peers. They're developing values, dreams, ideas of themselves and their futures alongside their integration. For those who are adults, they're doing the same thing. They're raising families. They're, building their economic life. They are navigating who they are in all the transitions of adulthood. And so there's this constant contradiction between their integration and their experience with the state denying them formal membership. And so as they figure out who they are, where they belong, they're navigating that contradiction. So the sort of main point that I want to state is that who the state defines as a member and how they, the kind of language they use and the rhetoric they use then becomes something that immigrants have to navigate as they figure out their identity.
Thank you. Hey guys, just feel free to jump in.
So I can give my 2 cents.
Sure.
So when we talk about identity development and immigration, we are really talking about two kinds of transition that both start with something quite concrete and physical. And when we think about identity development, it's puberty markers. Biological shifts comes with emotional and social change as well. But in immigration, there is a physical movement across space and time, but that move brings also emotional, social, and cultural transitions. So both are times of big change and moments that can open up for opportunities for growth and new possibilities, but also, and especially we see in youth, the population that I'm studying, times that carry a certain risk and challenges.
I can jump in. Sorry, I'm fighting with my cat. So thanks so much for organizing the symposium, and it's nice to see everybody. And I'll just pick up where Maya left off. You both said very important things, and I think for me, when you have this first question is the concepts of identity development and integration, how they're related to each other. I think the first thing that made me think about is just the importance of time. So how Erickson, of course, talks about time, about breaks in time. So the interviews he did with people, World War II veterans or Native Americans, trying to understand the past and how it's related to the present and then maybe the future. Sometimes there's breaks in that, and that can be very challenging. So immigration, so identity is about time, our past, our present, future. I think, of course, immigration is about time. There's also a before and an after, and not just for our individual lives, but also our kids or children of immigrants. So we can trace our immigration in terms of our individual lifespan, but of course our intergenerational lifespan, how our parents and our grandparents and our ancestors, how that affects who I am today. And then of course, socio-historical time as well. So being an immigrant now, as Daysi very clearly pointed out, there's really big challenges for that. And again, yeah, the US is my home country, so what ICE is doing right now and how the country is, there's another break of a before and an after. So I think, of course, all of this is intertwined. These breaks in time, these shifts in governments, this all, of course, intertwined then with identity and how young people, how they see themselves, what message, there's very clear messages that society is giving them, whether they're valued or not, or Daysi mentioned belonging, whether they're seen as a threat or a valued part of society or even human. So I think in many ways, of course, in immigration identity, they're very much intertwined, and we can think about different levels of time.
I would argue, building on what others have just said, which I think is amazing and entirely accurate. I think that anytime someone goes from one place to another, their whole sense of identity has to be revisited and reconfigured, because the idea is that what worked for me before may not work for me now, because the unwritten rules in the new country may be different. It may be that I'm here and what it means to be a father or a worker may be different. And so there are opportunities for me to change, but there are also some areas where I may not actually have a choice, if that makes sense.
I'm
Can you
going to
explain
comment on
that lesson? I'm sorry. Can you explain the last sentence?
Me? Yeah, so let's say that I'm a woman from a certain part of the world, and I'm going to Europe, or I'm going to the US, or I'm going to Canada. Um, what it means to be a woman may be different. And so I have an opportunity to essentially redefine myself as a woman. But there may also be some areas where I have to redefine myself because the ways in which I lived earlier may not be an option for me anymore.
I'm gonna come with another question, but I was just thinking about it myself in terms of how identity and immigration relate to each other, and I was thinking in terms of my research of the sometimes I wonder whether identity is almost the mutual relationship between them, because sometimes identity can be what leads to an immigration. Like it could be issues in your identity and sense of belonging, which may lead you to want to leave where you are because you may not identify with the country, and then you may. So in that sense, it may be what's leading to the immigration. Sometimes and always immigration is going to lead to a renegotiation of identity of who am I now? Who am I now that I've come to a new place? How do I integrate the different parts of my identity after having made that move? But also in my research, where I look at delinquency and substance use, identity can also be a moderator and a mediator. That identity can serve as a protective factor or as a risk factor. Like, how is my identity as an immigrant adolescent? How is my feeling of either my origin identity or my new host identity? How can that either be a protective factor for me while I'm going through the stresses of immigration, but also can be a mediator, like the immigration process and the stigma created or the discrimination, which can lead to a disturbance or challenges to my identity, which may then lead me to do problematic behaviors as a way of coping with that. And so, when you ask what's the relationship, I was like, what is it before? Is it after? Is it moderating? Is it mediating? I think the relationship between identity and immigration is so mutually complex that it's feeding into each other in different ways and at different ages, and also to do with, as Daysi, I think Linda's saying, to do with the social context and the politics and the policy that's around that. But since I'm host, I'm also going to ask you another question. I want to ask you all, because you've all been researching for a long time in the area, and I wondered how you see that the field has changed over time. Like, what development has there been in identity research within the context of immigration? Have there been trends or important milestones that we can look at as to how the understanding of the relationship between identity and immigration has changed over time? Don't all jump at once.
I can start off. I know.
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to talk maybe a little narrowly about the area that I am working in with ethnic racialized identity, because I do think there's been, the past decade or so, some really nice and important trends and movements and integrations that really, since 2014, there was a 21st century study group on ethnic racialized identity, trying to integrate the field into which is a little bit split, so there's people talking about ethnic identity that maybe focus more on culture and about immigration, so people who are maybe Latinx or Asian. And then there was a racial identity focus that included mostly African heritage or Black youth and families. And those were a little bit split, but in 2014, then this group got together, which was mostly US researchers. There's a few, I think, European ones in there, and published a series of papers trying to move the field forward and came up with this meta construct of ethnic racialized identities. I think that was a huge push. And there's one sentence in one of those papers in child development that Adriana was the first author. But it said something like, the process of ethnic racialized identity is necessarily going to be different in other countries outside the US because of their social historical context and conceptualization, for instance, of race-related issues. And then the next sentence was, so we're going to just focus on the US. And I think for me, like that was, I think they were very clear that a lot of the research up to that point is based in North America. But issues of racialization, ethnicity, culture, of oppression, discrimination, but also pride, joy, and who we are. This is all around the world. So I think another important development is really trying to understand very basic things, like how do we understand race in other parts of the world outside of North America, because it can be very different. So for me, it's been very interesting. I think, at least for this part of this ethnic racialized identity line of work, I think to me, it feels like it's opening up some more. When I started in Germany, people told me, well, we don't talk about those things, so it's going to be very hard to understand it. And you can't really talk about racialized identities. That's not true. But I think, questioning, I always tell my students to, or early career researchers, if you think about the constructs that you're studying, think about where they're conducted, yeah. And if it's mostly from one country, if you're what literature are you reading? Is it mostly from one country? What's your positionality? Like for me, I'm US American, reading mostly US American literature on ethnic racialized identity. It was important for me to read beyond. So to think very critically, my understanding of race and racialization has changed quite a bit in my 11 years in Germany, which I think has been very helpful to me. So I do think that this area of ethnic racialized identity, I think, again, what happens in the world, Black Lives Matter 2020, that was a global thing that happened. And I think that opened up conversations about these issues very much in some parts of Europe as well. So for me, that this has been I think is a good trend, be more open about this particular important identity.
Can you share what happened in 2020 for some of us who might not?
Oh, Black Lives Matter, the protesting against the killing of George Floyd by state police, an unarmed Black person, really kick-started globally this recognition that things need to change in our society, that there is anti-Blackness around the world. And again, in Germany, there's big protests in the major cities, but I think it also opened up a more critical reflection. That was 5 years ago. So things I think are, it's moving along, but whether things have gotten better, it's questionable as well. But this awareness of understanding minoritized experiences, particularly regarding race, which in Europe, again, it's not, we don't want to focus on that because of the history, but there is recognition that we must understand racialized identities also outside of North America.
And if I'll just build off of what Linda's saying, because I think that that's really important. Right, it's just this, as the field has evolved, and particularly as it comes to identity and immigration, this idea that there is one experience, and that we can kind of understand the experience of immigrants from Latin America, from Asia, et cetera. We now understand that it's way more complex, right? There's multiple lived realities and experiences. And the term that, we've been using is intersectionality, right? So, when we think about racialized identity, racializing immigrants, in addition to that, other identities like sexual orientation, sexual identity, disability identity, gender, that these things also really shape the experiences. And in the US, we saw a lot of activism from undocumented immigrant youth who really brought intersectionality to the table because they were queer, and they were undocumented. And they were drawing on activism that was learned from the Black social movements in the 60s and from the queer movements as well. And they were kind of merging these together to form their own undocumented youth, identity and, come out as undocumented, right? And tell their stories and feel empowered by telling their stories. So we know that, that's really important. And then the other part that I want to add that we're seeing a lot. So, immigrants get racialized, through being racialized, that justifies their exclusion in some ways. But they're also, there's this blending of crimmigration is what we call it, right? There's this blending of immigration and criminalization, so that there's this kind of push, to racialize and criminalize immigrants. And so that also needs to be taken into account when we think about intersectionality and identity and how these things are being used both in positive ways and ways that are harmful.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to follow Linda and Daisy. I think that we might also speak about our role as researcher. That first, I think that follow what Linda said, we should remember, well, maybe might be obvious to be modest and careful, and to remember that all of us have our blind spots that related to the place we're coming from. So there are some things that, of course, we have our specific lenses that through which we see the world, and it's our specific lenses. So that's something that I keep in mind all the time when I'm studying identities. And I want to throw some question to the group, and I'll be happy to have your thoughts, because I know I might be stepping into a tricky territory here, but it's really fascinating for me to think to hear what you're thinking. So there are some kind of identities. I think Linda spoke about, and also Daisy, about gender identity. We increasingly, well, some of us increasingly accept the feeling of fluidity, fluency, like fluidity and change. Yet in other areas, like in culture and specifically in racial identity, the same kind of flexibility is not embraced. So sometimes you have to pick your side in some way. So I wonder if you have some thought about why in gender identity it's possible and not in other kind of identities.
Can you clarify maybe what do you mean, like pick your side with like, yeah, what do you mean like pick your
yeah,
side?
I think that so for example in gender, I think that there is more and more feeling that you can be either, you can be both, you can change in time, you can change in place. So there is more flexibility. In terms of racial identity, I think to what I see in history, so like in some places, you cannot embrace, for example, another race. Is it right? So it's more related to something which is, I don't know. I'm here. Maybe I'm as an outsider. I'm asking here, but I'll be happy to hear your thought about it. Because for me, it sounds very similar. It's something that there is something that starts maybe something with physical appearance that does not match your self-identity, but then in some place you can choose, and in other place you cannot choose. So that's why I'm asking.
I feel as though, and maybe I'm not answering the right question, but I feel like when people enter into a new country, there is an ethnic or racial stratification process in that country. And people may be essentially classified into a group, not of their own choice, but because of how they look. I mean, if you look at it this way, people in the U.S. who are African, uh, they are viewed as black, even if that isn't something that they would actually say that they wanted. Um, so I feel like this, like everyone has to essentially figure out how they fit into the racial system in the country that they're in. And sometimes that can be hard, it can be hurtful, it can be painful. So,
Yeah, I tell me if I'm responding to what your question is, Maya, or not, but as you said, context plays a big role. So I think it's Kristen Parker who has studies, so like kids and social categorization of race. That kids who grew up in Hawaii they're much more flexible in how they see racial grouping. They're maybe not as static as if you grew up in the mainland in the US. So in that context, it's more fluid for them, how they understand racialized groupings. So I think the context of how we grow up definitely matter. I think, in the US, we emphasize like the five. There were so much, we talk about it all the time. We categorize, we have no problem talking in these categories, but that's if you grow up with these categories in your head, then if you don't personally, or people describe these, then of course it makes it harder to be flexible, I think. Yeah. And I think we do need, for instance, more understanding about being multiracial, because that also is a huge growing population that can help us also understand. I think understand that multiraciality that's a different experience in identity and socialization than monoracial. Many people are not monoracial. Also, there's a privilege in some ways to looking like a prototypical Asian person, for instance, because maybe people don't question me so much, if I say like I'm Asian. But for my kids who are mixed, maybe they're not Asian enough, or they're not white German or whatever. But how the people around us react to us, how the context is, growing up in Hawaii, which is very racially mixed, or another place, how we talk about racialization and how flexible that how flexible we think it is. I think that all plays a role in why or why not we can identify more easily or not across various groupings. I don't know, Maya, but.
I was wondering, I guess, Linda and Daysi, when you were saying, I was thinking about how social media and the global world impacts on the formation of a racial identity, because you can be in one country and you're seeing what it means to be black in another country, and actually it may be very different. Your experience may be very different, but the way in which our exposure to identity formation in other cultures and other countries may be impacting on young people's identity development across the globe. And the way in which, on the one hand, that can give a sense of comfort of, there's an anchor that you can develop an identity, but on the other hand, it may be quite far away from your own experience that's going on in your country. I know, for example, and I saw that one of our doctoral students, Ruthie, is here as well, that who looks at Ethiopian immigrants in Israel, and being an Ethiopian in Israel is very different to being a Black American, and the culture, the immigration story, the identity is very different, but that the way in which maybe digital social media impacts on that identity process going on with young people.
Mm. Yeah, I do agree with what Sophie said, and if I can just reply, Linda, I think what you said make a lot of sense. I think that what I'm trying to maybe tap on is to which extent the identity or the category we belong to is like something that suits us, that feel comfortable, that feels like that it's actually enhance us, or it's a prison that we or other people put on ourselves. I think that's the main thing that I try to, and that's why I thought about gender, which I find people these days find it more fluid and can navigate through it, while in other categories they tend to be more strict. So that's why what I had in mind.
I don't know if this connects. I was thinking, as I said, as an amateur, I was thinking back 30 years ago. Uh, the last big thing that I remember about identity and immigration was the John Barry model of acculturation, with strategies of acculturation, assimilation, and separation, and integration, and marginalization. And I was wondering, is this model still held up, or do we sort of take a look at it now and see that it was simplistic, perhaps not taking into account so many important things that we're now aware of? Maybe you'd like to remark on that. Anyone wants to?
I still teach it. My students learn this model, but I think it's just like the basics. Because when thinking like in the globalization world, when we think about just two identities, it doesn't reflect what people live in. And sometimes even when thinking about, for example, the media, they can adopt identity from a place that they've never been to. So I think the reality adolescents live these days are much more complex. I find it a very nice way just to think about how we move between identities. So I teach it, but I do think that there are development from this model. And we do think that there are also limitations to this model in terms of adjustment. For example, we were thinking, like for many years, we were taught that integration, this is the best strategy, but we know that it really depends on the context, speaking about the context, for example. So I think that we can start with this model, but we should develop to the current, I guess, yeah, present.
Seth, you are going like this. Well, what were your thoughts about it?
Yes, I'm sort of in the same ideas as Maya. Um, Barry's work is, I think he began to write in the 1970s, which is essentially 50 years ago. And so the world was really, really different. And we didn't have social media or cell phones, or Zoom or any of these these apps and opportunities. It was that you would really only be able to interact with other people in person. And so it made sense that there are only this culture and that culture. But I feel like in the years since this model was introduced, a lot of advances have occurred. And what we are seeing is that, first of all, people are able to acculturate without actually going anywhere. And so you see a lot of adolescents and young adults who immigrate, and they already are able to understand what's happening in the new culture because of being able to interact with other people online, etc. These are things that Barry didn't have in the 70s. So I would say that his model is a good place to start, but I feel like we have largely been able to go beyond it. And I don't think that we should be thinking of this model as the only way to look at acculturation. I feel like that would be very limiting.
Yeah, and I agree really with everything that's been said. There's value in it in terms of understand it, like it sort of as a way to think about different pathways, options as a categories to just, think about these are some options that could happen. But it's so much more complex, I think, now than that it's no longer useful to really box people into the categories and options. Um, and I've always struggled with the idea of like acculturation, assimilation is something that is even always desired by immigrants. Um, and at the same time, you know, even if you don't desire it, that it still happens. And so it's a very complicated process, right? You may not want to acculturate. You might really want to hang on to your group's culture, and yet because you live and work and um, engage your life somewhere else, you end up doing it anyway. There's a quote by someone that's like, you assimilate without even knowing it's happening, right? So again, like these things are just so complicated that I don't see it useful as the only way or the main way to think about it.
I think
Maybe,
like many models, it's almost context and age free. Like the idea as concepts, I think the concepts are useful, but then you have to say, well, how does that interact with age? So maybe for adolescents, assimilating is a more beneficial strategy, but maybe if you immigrate when you're much older, that's not possible, and that separation or the ability to keep your own identity, and also it depends on the context of where you've come to, the country and the receiving country's policy. So as a model, essentially it's context free or age free, but gender free, but it brings out concepts that we can relate to and dialogue with.
I agree with what everybody said. And I feel there are big advances. I also think too, like I think we all agree the berry boxes it's too restraining. And I think he recognizes as well. So he stopped doing the boxes after a while, right? So he does like big circles. But I feel like too, his original writings, they are much more complicated than what many of us researchers, like I use as berry boxes, in my own research, but I think his theoretical writings are much more rich and complex than what we end up with. And I think we kind of run away with that because it simplified things in a way that we could understand, which I think it's useful. Many of you said it's a good starting point, and I very much agree. And I also think so more current models like Frosso, Moti Stefanidi, and Suarez Orozco's model of immigrant origin, risk of resilience. If you look at that model, it's super complex. It's got everything in. I
You
don't
didn't
mean to
move
be
your
doing
hand because
that.
you moved your hand like that, then your
Oh,
thumb went up.
oops. Okay, so sorry. And I cite that model. I use that model. It also, in some ways, it's so complex that I don't know where to begin with it. Or, because everything, acculturation, immigration, it is all very complex. So for me, sometimes I think I appreciate the simplicity of the berry boxes. And just as I think everybody said, just we need to be very critical of how we are presenting that and using it, but at least a springboard. So I do feel like, if we are talking to seventh graders, so for those of us working with young people, talking about these issues, being able to be kind of clear, like it's okay that, you are also German, even if we've got kids saying, I don't know if I'm really German because my parents were born in Albania or something like that, so just giving them options of how to talk about themselves. I think that in that way, these ideas of bi or multiple aspects are useful, these different dimensions. So, but I agree with everybody that it's wonderful, theoretically, and there's also movement, and Seth and Maya and others, and all of you have contributed to that.
I'm gonna ask a kind of personal question of you all. That since you're all experts in the area, I'm interested to hear about a piece of research that each of you has done that you feel really proud of. That's something that you've been researching that you think that's something I want to share. I've got the opportunity to share it with 50 people here. This is what I want to share that I'm really proud of that I've been doing.
So if y'all don't mind, I'll go first. I also just want to note that I have a family situation I'm dealing with, so I let Ellie know that I have to jump off 15 minutes early. So I'll go first because I'll also need to jump off in a few minutes. So the research that I want to highlight was with undocumented immigrants, but they were immigrating as teenagers to the United States, and then transitioning to adulthood in the US. So what was, really interesting for me about that is that because they're coming to the US as teenagers, it's very different than the ones that come as young children who come with their parents, who grow up with the US school system. They are coming with a formed identity of their home country. I think somebody said earlier, the identity can drive migration, right? And so in this case, their sense of what roles they felt they wanted to take on, like helping family, becoming providers, needing to start working and having a lack of opportunities in their home country. All of that really did drive migration, and it was their decision. So as adolescents, they were making these big decisions about their future. Then they were immigrating and then encountering transitions of adolescence with facing legal exclusion in the United States, so facing all these barriers to work, schooling, financial stability, missing their family, and taking on adult roles. So because they were coming often to help family, they didn't enter the school system and they would start working and becoming financially independent. And so there was this huge clash between what we expect of 14, 15, 16-year-olds in the United States to be in school, dating, going out, and the lives that they were living. So I was interested in, well, how did they feel about their own sense of identity in terms of, did they identify as adults? Because many in the US do see them as adults because they're making these adult transitions. But I wanted to understand it from their perspective. And, similar to our network, I found that they did not identify with an adult identity, even as they were taking on these adult roles as teenagers. But it was much later when they had much more experience, when they felt not only that they could make these big decisions and had these big responsibilities, but they knew how to make good decisions and they felt more ready for their responsibilities that they identified with adulthood. So I'll stop there.
So
We're all so polite, or we're all so introverted that we cannot. Anyway, okay, then I'll just jump in. I think one of line of work that I'm happy about is, and some of you might know this, and I think Charlene Pevich, she's a PhD student who was one of the people in Germany that we have adapted Adriana Mania Taylor's identity project. So It's a school-based intervention where you talk for 8 sessions about ethnic racialized identities and many other things. So in the context of Germany, as I said, when we started off with this project, the feedback that we got is that's way too personal and it's way too taboo to talk about these things. It's going to be very, very difficult. And that was in 2017. So we're still doing that project. And overall, it's been really nice to talk with 7th and 8th graders. Oh, sorry.
No, I
Somebody,
was
okay.
just, I just muted someone. Carry on.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I'm proud of that line of research because I think these issues of growing up as a kid of color in Europe and how does it relate to who I am and how I feel about myself are issues that are not very openly talked about. So I'm happy, very happy with that line of work.
So I can go ask.
Yeah, Maya.
Oh, Sophie, you can share also if you want to before me.
No, I'm hosting.
What you're doing also research. Okay, so I think that in the recent years, my main passions are two lines of research: value development research and also ethnic identity research. So lately, I published an article that actually combined those two lines of research. And we study actually with really excellent group of people. I just mentioned them, Elad Daniel, Einat Elizarov, Noga Sverdlig, and Peter Titzman. And we studied what motivate adolescents from majority group and from the minority group to identify with national identity. So and we saw that there are different motivations. So they have the same identity, but the motivation with identify with the national identity have a very different sources. So for the majority, it's more about maintaining the status quo, being more in the line, the streamline. And for the minority group, actually, they identify with the national identity. It was more in a way to gain recognition and strengthening their place in the society. So it's really nice to see how they motivate from really different angle to the same identity.
I guess I'll go next. So I've been thinking about what I should actually talk about because there's a number of things that we've been doing, but probably the most interesting work I've been doing over the last couple of years has been looking at the other side of acculturation, which means the host nationals and how they are actually seeing immigration. And we actually collected a data set in early 2024 where as soon as I looked at this data, I said, oh my God, he's going to win. Because I looked at the data from all over the US and people were extremely negative about immigration. And I just said, this is not good. And so now we just actually collected another data set in the last maybe week or two, where we were asking host nationals to read a passage about immigration. Either it was positive or it was negative. And what we were finding is that that has a really large impact on emotions, on essentially how people are feeling about immigration. Um, and we know that that a lot of what's happening in the US and elsewhere is not based based on thoughts. It's based on feelings. It's based on people feeling as though all the immigrants are invading our country, etc. So what we are seeing is that essentially asking people to read a passage that looks at 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 immigrants as a threat, unfortunately, it works. So I'm not sure quite what's next, but there has to be something.
Maybe I'll jump in there, and then we'll open up for questions, I think. Just to continue on, one of the things that I worked on with a colleague of mine, Eugene Tartakovsky, was what we called a threat benefit model of attitudes towards immigrants. That came. I'm originally from London, and I was walking in the underground stations in London, and I saw all these posters up on the wall saying, "I'm an immigrant, I built your houses," or "I'm an immigrant, I'm a dentist," "I'm an immigrant, I'm a heart surgeon," and I looked at it and I thought, how rare is it that we see somebody discussing the benefits of immigrants and what immigrants bring? You know, we all like eating food from different cultures, but how little discourse there is about what immigrants bring to our societies and how they benefit us and how they enrich us. And very much as Seth says, the language of threat. And the model we looked at was both what predicts whether we see immigrants as threats or benefits, and we looked at personal values, but also the way in which our perceptions of immigrants as a threat or a benefit will impact then on voting, policies, behaviors, our willingness to be friends with and have contact with immigrants. And you know, I think that how we change that discourse of seeing people, immigrants as benefits and having something to bring to us, which is also about our identities as a host nation. How do we see us? What's our identity as a nation of how we relate to immigrants and how we see what people have to bring. You know, what does somebody's culture have to bring to our culture and our identity?
Thank you. Thank you. I see Daisy had to leave us. She apologized. I wrote in the chat, we'll be opening up for Q&A now. If anyone wants to ask something or add something that we can relate to, I know that we have to end it at 2 minutes too, because a few others mentioned that they have something coming on right afterwards. So if anyone wants to say something or ask something, we'll be happy to.
Or to share their own research or ideas that connect to what people have been sharing. I saw that Jeff took off your microphone. Was that a...
Yes, that's a sign. Hi,
That's a
everyone.
sign.
And thanks for this great presentation. Really enjoyed it. My question is, I'd like to hear the panel focus more on the developmental issues here, especially with regard to emerging adulthood. It's really striking to me, as I understand it, that the 20s is the decade where migration is the highest. And so what does that tell us about the developmental factors that are involved in migration? Why is it the 20s? Is it related to identity issues? Is that when they're deciding who they are, and part of that is deciding where they are? Or are there other things involved? I'd like to hear what the panel knows about that.
That's cool, Jeff. That was our next question on the list, which we didn't get to.
I think it's probably some of each. I think that people often migrate either before they have kids or right afterward, and that's often in the 20s. I think that people also want to migrate before they have a lot of existing commitments. And so in the 20s, you really don't have a lot of things that are solidly in place. So I think that is often the time actually to make a move.
I want to relate in two ways. I mean, I immigrated when I was 23, and I definitely see it as part of an identity process. But I want to answer your question in another way also, is that what happens to immigrants when they get to emerging adulthood? Like how, because I think emerging adulthood is a time which leads immigrants to reassess their identity. We did a study looking at Ethiopian immigrants in Israel, emerging adults, a paper about how they reclaim the names that they were born with. Because a lot of immigrants, when they come to Israel, their names, they change their names to take on more Israeli names. I'm not sure what happens in other countries. And what we see is that during emerging adulthood is a time with a lot of immigrants decide to take back the names that they had, that they were born with, the names that their parents gave them that are connected to their culture. And I think that immigrants who come when they're younger, when they get to emerging adulthood, there's a reassessment of their identity and their immigrant identity at that point of who am I? Like, okay, I came as a child, but now I'm an emerging adult and I can make my own decisions about my name, my culture, who I am. I think it leads to a reassessing of the identity process at that age.
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder how much of it is just reaching cognitive and physical maturity. I mean, it's a physically strenuous thing, right, to migrate, the migration itself, but then often when they reach the country they're migrating to do, the work that's available to them, which is often off the books, is really physically hard, right? It's in things like, it's like kitchen work, and it's caring for elderly people, and it's construction work. And those are the kinds of things a 22-year-old or a 25-year-old can do a lot better than a 15-year-old. And also the cognitive challenge of it is immense, right? You get to this country you haven't been to before, and you have to figure out everything about how to live there. How much do you think just reaching cognitive and physical maturity is involved in it?
I mean, I would agree, of course. So I'm thinking I was in my adolescent class when we talk about puberty and all that, and all what age, well, Jeff, from your book, from a long time ago too, what age are we the most fit? It's in our emerging adulthood. Yeah. So I always tell my class, it's downhill from here in some ways. Yeah, that our bodies can take a lot when we are in our 20s. We can go out and do things, and that's why there's also higher drug use or drinking, because we can recover easily. So I definitely agree that being physically one of the best physical times of our lives, that's probably one reason why. And I agree too, I mean, with the unaccompanied minors, that there's enough research that is very stressful to come when you are so young. Especially without having strong caregivers with you. So that challenge of doing all that at 14, that's not, developmentally it's more challenging. So I agree definitely with those two biological cognitive aspects.
Okay, I see we have a few more comments in the chat. Deronka from Nigeria, did you want to ask something?
No, really. How are you? It's been a. I'm so sorry to say that where I am presently has made it a little bit difficult to follow all through. My internet, has been fluctuating, so it's made it a bit difficult. And it's my first time of joining with this body. I'm a member of SSEA, and oftentimes I get emails from ISRI. So I felt, wait a minute, since I'm in SSEA already, I can also get into this. So, which is why I'm here today. But
Welcome.
unfortunately, my internet has been fluctuating, which made it, but I heard the concepts of acculturation and the fact that it's easier for children that are brought into US, when they are still in childhood, unlike the adolescents, those ones they are the ones that have issues, a bit of issue, settling down into acculturation and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. I see there's a question from Ishwar. If panelists can describe work with community organizations. Have any of you done such work? Want to share something about insights on that?
Not, I think in the chat it says leaders of communities. I mean, the work that we do is school-based. So that's how we are understanding identity, through how high school students are trying to understand who they are. So with I'm just reading the chat. So yeah, things have changed, I think, in terms of working with schools before and after COVID. So I think that it was easier to work with schools before COVID, and I think afterwards it's been more challenging. So, but that's how we get connected. Oftentimes it's luck. So we contact schools, we try to share how there's enough work on the identity project now that we can actually show them some also empirical evidence that it seems to be positive in some ways for some kids. And we have enough experience now with like training teachers how to do this, so we can talk about teacher experiences. So, and I think in the beginning when we were just starting off, sometimes it's just luck, for us, it was a teacher that approached us that wanted to do a project. So I think that that's the best. Like, we had worked in schools for a couple of years and got to know the teachers, and it was a teacher that actually approached us and asked if we could do a project. And the identity project, we had just started with that, so it fits. So I do think that these connections that you are building with communities, it takes time. It really, we started in 1917, and they knew us for like a year, I think. But that's how we started, just trying to spend time for them to get to know us. And then that's how we built up over the years. But it's challenging. It's challenging.
Okay. If anyone else wants to relate to this question or what Robin Pavish of course mentioned something which is very important, in that the context of immigration, as far as whether it's voluntary or not, would make a really big difference, I would assume, if anyone wants to relate to that, or Robin wants to say something.
So I just can give another tip that helps me to work with immigration population. So it's not about the community, but I'm working the same as Linda with schools, but I also have research actually with Seth Schwartz on families. And the way that helped me is to have my research team, all my research assistants, they are immigrants themselves from the same population that I'm studying. So therefore, I think it's really important first in order to design the study, because they have different, we spoke a lot about the context. So in many cases, they have a specific perspective that I'm lacking as an outsider, so it's really important. And also in order to get connection with the community. It's really helpful to speak the same language, but not just the language, of course, everything that's related to the culture. So I think that's something that I would first invest in, to have the right research team.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up here. I know that Seth has to leave, and I don't want to overextend our time. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, our panelists. It was a pleasure to have you here, and thank you, Sophie, for joining us. And we will be in touch and let you know about other things that we have up our sleeve, and we'll be happy to continue dialogue on these issues and others. So thank you very much, and
thank you,
have a
Elli,
good night.
for putting this together and bringing everyone together like this across the globe.
Thank you, Elli.
Great.
Yeah, and thank you
Yeah,
all.
thank
Been
you
awesome.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Sophie.
Bye.